This is IBM Museum. I'm still here with the NCR 3220 for this video. I want to go over the CPUs. We're going to do a little testing. I'm going to see what I can do for swapping around, but going through and benchmarking the different levels and looking at that cooling aspect as well. And we will have a time where I'll do a little bit of video capture as well, but I'm going to go through and I'll pause the videos at the time so I go through and do the boring things like swapping CPUs. I think I've got relatively straight pins, but I'm not going to necessarily bore anyone during those purely inactive processes. And I've gone through and I've just modified the autoexec.bat to not automatically load Windows 3.1 on startup. Even though I wouldn't show that on video, it just gets me back to the DOS prompt a little bit quicker. So those pauses at my end aren't as long for running through the video. But let me go through, pause the screen. I'll get off the camera here. And certainly I'll be back on this aspect later on when we go through the screen captures. But I'll start from there and just showing what I've got. And it was kind of amusing to me, looking at the aspect of getting a fan put in here using this power lead on these pins. I looked around my little fans, and I even had 4 of these in a brand new in bag. And these look like the little thin, probably 40 millimeter. I need to get out a ruler and measure these things too, and maybe I can post that in the comments of what the dimensions of these are. But when I looked, and these are very common on top of like the old 486 heat sinks of that style. When I did look and tried to match it up, it does look like it's a little bit shy of that in here. And I don't know if this is maybe as a non-standard, like a 50 or 60 millimeter fan. And again, I'll get that out and measure it. So we can set those aside, but I did go through, and I guess I should size it before I start talking. It looks like that matches up. And this looks almost brand new to me as well. It doesn't have necessarily any dust from use. It's got dust from sitting on me. But if this thing had been used, it would have some pretty integrated dust in it. I'm just looking to see how that's coming up on camera. And, look, it's got the 4-pin lead right for that. And again, that's on kind of a classic 486 style heatsink that would be put in place. And of course, having this on even a regular CPU in here would be a little bit high profile. I want to go through, besides just the factor of that this is a little bit higher profile for me to have an adapter, microchannel adapter in that bottom slot, that I just want to go through that and kind of test things. I do have some faster CPUs, even though that's an OverDrive Processor CPU, that I want to go through and test the levels with, just to kind of see, to get a little bit of a baseline. Since I do have it in place, I'm going to go through with that. And no, I'm not going to put on the fan initially, especially when it's talking about going through and measuring this with my infrared heat gun. When I did this a moment ago, it was it's starting to get warm up. It's about 125 Fahrenheit right now, and we'll probably see that that climb up. I've had it on for probably about 10 minutes or so. And as always, I can go through and check that clock to see how long I've had the system on, because I'm always having to use that F1 key for the time and date not set. And when I go through and the date rolls over just fine. It's the oddest thing, but the computer always starts that clock at midnight from when I powered up for the DS1387 that's in there instead of the Dallas 1287. And so I've had the system up. The interesting thing was I went through and I found I have another CPU that's identical to the one that's in here, an OverDrive CPU. Now on the bottom, and I had to see even how visible this is, can you see the spots for the pins? And it's almost like not necessarily it's a corrosion in a way, but it almost looks like it almost looks like the metal is not there for the pad. And these are pins, of course. And the pins look pretty clean for all that. But, you know, it's, as I say, with the pins being there and they all look straight, this thing has not been, well, pretty much straight. This thing has not really necessarily been abused, but I just wonder what environment. It might be even handy sometime to plug this in just to even see if it goes through and works. And maybe this is even a learning experience, because let me get on my glasses again. Well, I was getting on my glasses here. I just want to look to see and make sure I didn't lie. Or maybe it'll give me a little bit of insight. I saw those. And so you can see the inner pads, and those don't have pins at the corners there. There's pins, but that doesn't have a pin along the, and I thought when I looked at this earlier that it should have a pin in the corner, because I thought, and this is an SZ959. Oh, SZ957. And this is an OverDrive. Oh, okay. So, no. DX4. See, this is marked. DX4 ODP R. Okay, and that the critical thing is that R100. So this is the non-overdrive, well, the replacement overdrive level. In other words, this would go through and it doesn't have the extra pin and would be put in place of an existing CPU in a socket. It doesn't have that extra necessarily that's treated as being a disable pin, or telling the system that it's got a CPU in the socket. And we're going to have to find out what part that plays with this socket on this NCR system, of whether that's going to be in fact, because as I said the other day, this shouldn't have the R. This should just be DX4 ODP100. So it doesn't have the R for the replacement in the part number. So it's a teaching. And this is the same equivalent, the 1.1 version. Same copyright dates, everything else. Just Intel released CPUs of sequential aspect numbering that were slightly different in that functionality. You know, just the only thing that differs from that is that pin. So let's go over that aspect as we could. And of course, we're looking at, you know, pin 1 is here on this corner. I mean, it's still, that gives us a nice view of the orientation that we need. The CPU sits in the socket this way, as you can see. So pin 1 is in this corner. As I would say, the southwest corner, or what we see in some of my videos is the sun sets and comes through that window as it sets in the west. It shines on this recording area. But that's pin 1. And this chip has all the voltage regulator components and everything else that it needs here. Capacitor for buffering that power. So that is good having around, even though it differs. And that was a kind of a teaching experience for those of you who didn't know about the pin numbers. Now, the getting to the pin 1 aspect, this is another CPU we'll test, and this doesn't have a heatsink. I'm really interested in what the heat is going to be for this. And as you can maybe read, I don't know how well this webcam can focus at that length. This is one of the so-called blue lightning chips, or at least it's the DX2 version of what they have as the blue lightning. I've got some blue lightnings that are in ceramic packages as well, and this is a DX2, and normally this would be a 66 megahertz, which is effectively in the part number. I just want to see how warm this gets. I got this a couple months back, and as I was talking, pin 1. So as you'll notice, one of the corners looks a little bit different, and it's marked as the SQFP1. And I don't know if they're using the S as a square, a Q is quad, the flat pack, as we've read before. So they're marking pin 1 on that for the chip that's on here. And this has the square on the corner. All the rest are triangled off identically. We do see this A1 over here, and we want to kind of pay attention here because this is tricky bad in my opinion. Makes you think that this pin grid array section, it makes you think that pin 1 is on this corner with that square. And so, and I don't know what this little sticker is, warranty label for whenever that warranty, maybe sometime in 1993. Maybe that sounds about right. Maybe. So when we look at the pin grid array side, and none of the PCB that this is on, none of the corners are beveled like we'd expect to show pin 1. However, when we look at, and I don't know how visible a round pin would be from, or the round solder pad area would be compared to a square solder pad area. And square, a square marking, a square solder pad, and generally the manufacturers, they try and make pin 1 on all the chips are oriented the same direction a lot of the time. If they have the ability or laid out the printed circuit board in the correct way. That's not always the case, and you do want to check. And in particular, you want to check the orientation with this. I mean, that makes a lot of difference. And as we see with the square on this corner for that one pin, that is indeed what it is marked at as that 1A. And basically what that means is it's the A column here and the one row, or however you want to organize your rows and columns. I guess A would be a row, 1 would be a column, and that meaning the outer pins there are that row 1. This column is the A pins. The next column in is the B column. The next row up is the 2 row, and they keep that numbering all the same even for the gap of here. So it would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on up. And the columns would advance this way since we're looking at the underside A, B, C, D this way. So if we have a pinout diagram for a 46 CPU, it's under that. But this corner is pin 1. And you even look at it to where this would be the regular orientation for the OverDrive CPU with the lettering upside down in you guys' view at the lower edge of that webcam that I'm using. And in this case, if I have alignment for pin 1, and then pin 1 is also marked on the chip itself with that dot, and you'll see that in a lot of cases on chips, even CPUs, the dot, just like we had on the CPU that's in here. But this is the proper orientation on this motherboard, on this NCR system, of being there to where the lettering looks like it's right side up for you guys. And of course, these do not have that OverDrive pin. And we're going to find out, if the system supports whether it's got that OverDrive pin or not. Now, this is what they, as I commented the other day, I think this is an Evergreen. And they even came out with on one of the systems that I had on video before, we had an ET-DIAG, or ET-DIAG, and that's Evergreen Technologies. And it was a lot of time it was for testing these chips, and they just rebadged basically, I think, the landmark test, which we'll see a variant of that as well. And these have the voltage regulator, and they have some jumpers on there. They're marked, and I'll probably look at those. Okay. So I may even have to get out a better magnifier. And I have a few of these around. And most of them look like they have pretty good... see, in here... Well, I guess both of them marked. But it has Evergreen Technologies Incorporated marked here on the silk screen. Again, I just don't know what the webcam can... its ability to really show up close. And... the jumpers are marked, and on both of these, I have the jumpers in the same positions. I would think that would be a default for running it as a DX4 133 megahertz internally. Yeah, it has like a 3X. Yeah, so that's the jumper for the 3X, and it's set to 4X with this little jumper here in the middle. Right back or right through for this jumper. And so the thought is if it's able to do right back, that's a better, higher performance in that sense, or a little bit better performance than right through cache. But saying it to right back can have some compatibility consequences sometime. And that's just something to check. Sometimes if you have a CPU in, you can try and switch it over to right back and see... make sure that right through has the better performance than right back. So both of these are set to the right back mode. If I were to have any compatibility issues, I would move it to right back. Easy to get those confused. Another learning experience. I'm going to stumble on some of the stuff, and this has, for the one side, it's marked as normal. And the other side is marked as... can't necessarily read what it says there. It's like a different socket type is what it seems like it... and so we might even find out that. That may be kind of... like I say, that's just typically a sense pin, that extra pin in the center ring that these don't have to go through and effectively disable. And that pin alone, it's not like a float pin on like the older 386SX sort of things, CPUs. The pin is just a keyway, but ultimately it's the CPU understands from that, and the motherboard understands from that it's in an OverDrive socket. It's the correct CPU. And this has pin 1 marked real nice. And so with it like that and easy access to these jumpers, we just might remember that normal or this for compatibility as well, just to see if that will have maybe any impact. Because these Evergreen Technologies, these things are pretty well thought out for upgrades of systems, and they encountered that whether they're going to put that OverDrive pin on there. Now, the Trinity, so-called Trinity upgrade CPUs, and at least I've got this on a little static block, anti-static block, to effectively protect it. Pin 1 marked very well again. These have the voltage regulators. I mean, it's got that bigger heatsink on for that smaller chip inside. And then even on the other side, marking pin 1. Now, these do have that OverDrive processor pin with the thought, if you're in a normal socket, this pin is not connected. It's hanging free in the center of a CPU socket. And these things are also very well thought out, and at least there's still documentation for all these switches. And these switches here are in a default position that we're going to we'll just go with that. Now, if I have to make any adjustments, I may have to look at that to find out a switch saying, and this is the A block and this is the B block. If I can find that documentation, I saw it recently before, and I can post it, what the link is. And I got these off an eBay auction, and I even picked up, I think, 2 or 3 of them as it is. Real nice, and they were good prices. Even the, I don't know if it's been sold out. I think the last time I looked at the auction, the seller still had some for offering. So these are apparently still out there and still fairly good prices. So as I said, we're not going to put the fan in place to pull it off the heatsink that it's on for any results here. We are going to go through, and also I'm going to do the initial test with the existing CPU in place. That's come up to temperature. It's right at that 135, 136 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that's 85 degrees Celsius. I just happen to know that conversion off the top of my head. I'd be hard put for any other temperature conversion, but I know that. So we're going to test this in place. And I did have the Kingston utility. Normally this comes with those 386 now upgrade boards. This is the driver diskette, has for running all the cache. But what I did with this as well is it has the landmark utility, and I even looked at the batch file that is on there, and that will help too, because I'm just going to run it as it runs from the batch file, because normally that landmark version 2 has like a splash screen and initially goes through and tests video. I'm wanting to test the CPU, and normally the FPU, the floating point test for the landmark, is notoriously inaccurate. I've looked around for a little bit better of speed testing an FPU, because that's going to come in later on with having like that 287 on the MUL 30 286 planers that we'll go through and test and try and see what speed that we can determine that FPU is set at. But I went through and previously I've loaded those files onto the hard drive. I'm otherwise set to go, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to I'll go through and pause and get the screen capture set up. Now we remember from the other day the undocumented PC that we went over all those details, and we tested the CPU aspects, and it gave some mysterious rating, a speed rating of 60 for the megahertz. And I don't know exactly why that is, because this is a DX4 100 megahertz. It should normally have this clocked at 100 megahertz internally. That's why I want to bring in the to go through and test with utilities and see what it's clocked at, and see maybe we can determine why that is. It might be a setting on the board otherwise that is treating that a little bit differently. And that top of that CPU, I mean, it's 135 degrees. You can notice that. I think I used my thumb as a little bit of a heat sink there momentarily. And I'm expecting all the other components otherwise are behaving as proper. So let me get pause and get the screen capture, sit down to where you guys can see me again. And I'll just run through this test. From there, I'm going to pull that OverDrive processor. So we revert back to the 486 that's soldered in, and we'll take I'll see if I can get a closer look at that to show what that is. And then we'll just go through from there and alternately swap in some CPUs and test what speed they show us that they're clocked at, what performs better, and just do some empirical testing here. Okay, so here I am, DOS prompt. I'm going to go through so I'm not running over my keyboard cable and ruining it. So let's just do a time to kind of see. I mean, this system has been operating for 36 minutes now. So that's why that CPU is up to temp. And then let's go through. I've got maybe just to show it, I'm using the batch file as they had on the diskette as well. If I would get it typed in, I do have a Model M keyboard here. Here's some nice little clicks. So it just echo off, and then it runs the speed 200 utility. The B is like where it doesn't do the splash screen, I think. There's and the Q is quiet, so it doesn't make the clicks, the noise. You can turn that on if you want. And then there's something about doing that initial video test as well. So we'll just do the speed, the batch file. Okay. So here, and of course we all have it's all graphed out. And it's branded as the Kingston Technologies utility, but it's the Landmark System Speed Test version 2. It's standard thing out there. And like I say, what's up with that FPU? It's just odd. And we can see that rating there. And I mean, it's just got numbers across the top, but up above it says the CPU clock at 60 again, or 60.062 megahertz for some odd reason. And so we're going to see, I mean, just what exactly that socket is up to, because that is just, that's a little nutty. So escape to exit out of there to get back to that DOS prompt. And of course, we'll have to power down for pulling CPUs. I'll go through and I'll switch it again, just so I can go through initially on that, pulling that first CPU. But like I promised, I'm not going to take you through all this boring stuff. So we do that, and we take me off screen, and we go through, and I power the system down. And I've got the classic, Intel fork. This is a device for that Intel supplied with these units. And normally you even may want to go through and pull this power entirely. If you're messing around, you're getting metal things wedged down in certain places and everything else. You do want to make sure that you do not have power. And some power supplies and some boards can have a portion of them that's live when the power supply is plugged in. And it's not necessarily a hot potato, and it's a little bit working on a system like this. I might have to see if I can pull. I mean, I'm gonna have to pull that when I put a fan on those pillars anyway. And it just looks like the fan is, like I say, still low profile, and just kind of sits in there. And then there's some holes in that metal case, but that gives me a little bit better access to get at some of these far sides. I promised I wouldn't be too boring. Now that we're reverting to, so that's it. It's got that, and it's got that pin on the inner side. And it's interesting, the other one that doesn't have the pin has those 4 on the inner side of that. And like I say, it might be worthwhile testing that one first, just to see if it works, because that's the only difference between those two. And I wanted to go through and just briefly, and we learned the trick with these plastic pinch pieces is to roll them the one way. Just want to briefly pull this, exposing that 46 SX in a quad flat pack. Oh gosh. I got a flashlight, but it's way too bright. Maybe we can just use my phone. So that is a 46 SX25 megahertz. And it is S-Spec SX683. Copyright of 1989. So that likely does not have the on-the-fly CPU ID. Now that we've identified that, we could just put, nothing else. We've already looked at what the CPU is. There's no reason to have this diskette drive hanging off, although we could just spin it out of the way, but we don't really need to be under there. And we do the same reverse of spinning that in place. I think I've got the arrow correct. Yeah. Okay, and we could go through, now that we've pulled the CPU, and I'm doing plugging back in by feel, and let's go through and power that on. Flip around here once again. In fact, I'll probably get the keyboard up into place where I can see it better. We will get the system all back on the screen. We will get me back on the screen. Hello. And wearing that IBM swag again. Shirt and hat. Okay. Let's go to initialization. Press F1. Now this will go through and I still left that high mem sys in there for some reason. This takes some time too. Next time for this, as I go through and swap the CPUs, I promise I'll pause the video for these sections. And we just do speed to do that batch file. Okay, so strangely, for whatever reason, 25 megahertz CPU as it's marked in there, but it runs at 20 megahertz. And that's why the clock tripled CPU is showing up as 60. A clock doubled would likely show up as 40. And I bet you didn't know Intel actually produced a 486 DX 40 megahertz. I've never encountered one in person, despite all the things. And of course, it really okay. So the FPU, it's funny that that's still tracking with some sort of number because the 486SX does not have an FPU built into it. And so I think we're good for that baseline of knowing at least why the increments of 20 megahertz are reported. One of the things that I left that I could have left that diskette drive off place just for going at this with the infrared thermometer, and it's showing up as just at 92 degrees for that 486SX being run at 20 megahertz. So let's power down. I'm going to pause, and I'll actually unplug the power and things like that. And we'll get just going through the CPUs from here. No particular order. Okay, I'm just going to briefly unpause. I went through and tried some things here. The first CPU I tried was that OverDrive, that ODPR 100. And just because the only difference was between those pins of that extra pin on the inner side, and the system didn't respond at all. There's just not any video. And I thought, well, that could be because that CPU might be bad too. And so I went through and I put in the Blue Lightning, the IBM Blue Lightning CPU. So an IBM CPU on an NCR system. And I don't have any video for that as well. So apparently, and there are ways to trick that OverDrive pin. I can probably get into that in a later video. I'm not really prepared with the wire segment that I could use in that instance to do that. I got to figure out, is it tied high or is it tied low? It's just a sense pin of that's at play there. And so I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to pull. I may try the Kingston adapters in there and try that normal and that other setting on that jumper just to see if that has an effect, if we can get by without an OverDrive pin in that regard, because that's the CPU I would ultimately like to put in there. It's a clock quadrupled and it is that low profile. It allows me to get a microchannel adapter in that bottom slot. So we're going to try that, and then as the last step, try that Trinity, because that Trinity adapter does have an OverDrive pin on it, although it's the same profile as that OverDrive processor that we had in there before, that just doesn't allow a long adapter to be put in that bottom slot. So that's not necessarily as ideal as well, but I'll go through and test it. But for not having that, what appears to be that OverDrive pin, that has curtailed a little bit of the testing, in particular to this Blue Lightning CPU that's in there. So let me pause and get things worked around again, and I'll be back. Okay, I wanted to just go back to the SkyCam for a moment. I did put that Evergreen Technologies CPU in there, just like what I've got in my hand, and so this is a little bit of another learning experience for us. It was set as just like this one is, with this jumper here being labeled as normal is the aspect that was closed, and when I powered the system on, I didn't get anything. No video once again, no beeps or anything else like that. Just it's not any CPU that's running the system basically. But as I say, these things are well enough thought out that once I went through and changed that jumper over to the other pin, just took it off, and I'll have to read closer on what that says. It says something like that's an OverDrive, and I'm trying with a little jumper. Get my glasses on again. I wanted to do on camera, but no worries. Okay, so there is that jumper put over to the other position, and rotate it around, and pin 1 being here again. So that effectively makes this thing work in an OverDrive socket without having that pin on the inner corner. And effectively that pin is on this inner corner here, since that's the pin 1 area. But that's the neato cool kind of things about these upgrades. And let me put this one back to the normal position. And yeah, sure, we can go through and we can probably test the Trinity unit, even though I'm really right now I'm at the position that of what I want to be on the system. Let me go through to get the video up. We didn't have to sit through that boring high mem sys count. I'm going to get me back up on the screen. Okay, and since that is clock quadrupled, it's showing as the 80 megahertz as well. And that the Trinity that we test next should do that as well. So, and we're set to that, also to that write through mode in the L1 cache. And that is supposed to be a little bit higher performance. If we would have had any compatibility issues, I could have set that to the write back or the standard position that it would expect for older CPUs or less capable CPUs, just for that compatibility. Now, truly, I would want to run all the software on the system. I would want to run the Windows and everything else, just to make sure that we don't crash the system with that in place like that. But that's the other, learning thing on that regard is, to try those jumpers, knowing what they do, because you may be able to get slightly better performance. I don't know if it'd necessarily be worthwhile for me to go through here and if the landmark 2.0, maybe there's a later point where I can get more aware people to respond as far as the testing on a good thing that would see a difference in that regard. The UNPC. In fact, let's since we got it, and we can also do this on the Trinity module as well, just because we have. I mean, it's got the same CPU built in. It's got that AMD 5x86, 133 megahertz, and CPU information. Okay, so FPU inside, of course. It's AMD, authentic AMD with the vendor string. 80 megahertz, as we found. Prefetch Q is the same. We see the differences in the, reading that in reverse. Now, that it might be interesting that jumper, I mean, the system won't run without that jumper being in normal position anyway, but it looks like the CPU is changing with that jumper saying as well. And that's the critical thing. Like I say, the CPU sometimes on how it identifies itself to the system, saying, "Hey, it wants to simulate that it's an OverDrive CPU." So I'm thinking that max reg over in the far right-hand side of the CPU ID is mimicking that OverDrive processor. Maybe we should have looked at that with the even the 486SX in there as well, to just tell if that's an angle for that. And then family 4, of course, Model E stepping 4. And internal CPU cache enabled with write back. It is not, with that saying as write through, it's not identifying it that way. So I wonder if that's a bug or might need to be tested a little bit further in that to see how that responds with a CPU that's able to be set to the an L1 cache as the write through mode. So that does tell us a little bit there, even under the UNPC, as we saw the other day. Get back here to the DOS prompt. I can probably get the Trinity swapped in there just to do testing for it as well. And then I'll actually revert back to this Evergreen Technologies CPU and get through and installing the fan as well. So let me get a pause and power down and pull the power plug and swap the CPUs again, and I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, and so what was one thing that we didn't do when I had the Evergreen Technologies CPU in here for this SkyCam? I didn't go through and run the infrared thermometer on it. I forgot to. But since we're reverting back to this CPU anyway, it's not really going to be we'll test it at that time. Now I popped in the Trinity, and I want to also have go over something else. Now, as I have this this extraction tool, and you go at the socket, you can go through and just get it right above that socket. I'm glad I had the other one as reference, because you don't want to get Well, it can go in there. It can get wedged in there. And you could be thinking that you're pulling it out of the this assembly out of the socket when you're actually going between the two PCBs. And thankfully I had that second one to kind of look at things, and I paused. Don't be hasty in going through this. And all this stuff is, of course, at your own risk if you do it. But, I had to think, hey, that assembly, it's just not flush with the circuit board like it is for that Blue Lightning. I mean, that goes through and easier to do. But it's this, the Evergreen Technologies has this assembly here, so you get the tool on top of that to get it out of there, to extract it. So just be careful and take your time. Be aware of where you're getting those tools in. Now, as I said, I went through and I plugged the Trinity in there based on just the settings that are probably default for the way that this system's set. And even though this is very configurable, and I'll provide the link, and the link is troublesome too because it's using the web archive actually to go back in time. If you try going to the link directly now, it's dead. So I mean that information has been captured out there, but and I'll show the link. I can put the link down for that as well on where to access these settings. And fortunately, these are on the underside, and so you get through, and you have to have the CPU plugged in to test it. And then if you got those settings where you need to look at those, you have to pull the chip to be able to adjust it, not just a simple 3 jumpers for the basic things here. And I'll bring up what those switch settings mean. Let me go through and pause the video, get up on the screen. I'll bring up the switch settings, and we'll take a closer look at them at my bench, just to see if we can go through and get the Trinity set to be operational on this session of what we're doing. And it's probably the same thing on the saying it to that OverDrive, even though it's got that OverDrive pin in here of those settings. So let me go through and pause. Okay, and I guess I need to get on screen too here. Get with my reading glasses. I have the Trinity Works CPU. It's labeled on one of these corners. I've been identifying it as the Trinity, and actually has Trinity Works. And I'm going to have to link the page in the video description as well, because it doesn't show which web page I'm on. I'm actually on a web archive page. And at the top here of this page is the original address, but that address is dead now. So it's, as you see, it's going back to April 15th of 1998 for this web archive of the settings. Now mine, for the, we get looking through, and they show all the position, really nice page and graphics and things like that for that. But then our option 1, and I believe that's what the holding, orientating the, and see, I have left to right. In my A block, I have up, 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 down, up, down. And so I don't even have any okay, and this is the settings for the 4x pass-through. Okay, A1, A2, A3, A5, and B1 through 8 are up. Switches A4 and A6 are down, off. is the default settings. And that is what I have as my default setting. And yeah, and for all my B switches are set to up. Option 1, 4x right through, leave the default switches A1, A2, A3, or A1, A2, and A5, and B1 through 8 to on. Turn switch A3 off. Okay. And option 2, 4x pass through. And I debate on seeing this page before if it's talking about the, I don't know if it's talking about the cache or what exactly. So and they're saying for all the for option 2, that's even going through and inverting all of the B. And then, and I still think it's something to do with kind of that normal or OverDrive processor thing. Option 3, 4x right through. And having a lot of that stuff off. This is the 3x settings. Right through, pass through. And then it even has, I'm supposed to be able to interact with these. Okay. So I clicked on, if those settings don't work, click on that. Okay, pass through, right back. And quite a few variations, and normally we want this as a to the 4x mode, clock quadrupled rather than clock tripled. And all it has is the pass through, and I don't know if to do the simple. And I guess I can go back by this recommended settings link at the top. Okay. And this is a revision E. And then they even have a link for the revision D version. And I'm pretty certain that I have the, is it labeled? Yeah, 1997. It's on the corner. There's one of the corners where it has the Trinity works. And it's 5x86 revision E. Copyright of 1997, so of about the same time as the archive, and then Trinity works. So I'm sure I have the revision 11. I was just hoping for a little bit more information. I may have to kind of think about this a little bit more. At least we know, and I'll link in, and for the information of having the CPU on video and the settings, but I may need to work with that a little bit more, and maybe even have another 46. I mean, I was intending these for PS2 mul 77s or 76 with the 46 CPU, like a Bermuda-based planer. Could take these and work very well. But I think I want to stay those, but I'll do the link in the video of where to find this information as well. And I've scrolled down through it to show me looking at the settings. But I think I want to go through and just plug that Evergreen Technologies CPU back in there. That was working with the one switch saying, and then go through and temperature testing, and then we'll go through and put the fan in place and connect it up as well for the video. And I mean, even here, we're over an hour worth of time already, me prattling on. It's going to be about the same length as the previous video. So I'll be right back with that. So I've got the Evergreen Technologies CPU back in place. I'm letting things kind of warm up as it is, just so we can kind of observe some conditions for that normal operating temperature of that CPU. And as I noticed too, you can see the very top of the screen. I wanted to kind of show that it's giving me a 301 keyboard failure, and it's a standard IBM mul M keyboard that's plugged in, and it works fine. I did have an NCR keyboard at one point. Had a nice PS2 plug, nice keyboard, just a standard 101 key variety, and I lost it. I don't know where the thing is. It's been lost for years, and I don't remember doing anything with it. I thought I searched around years ago when I remembered I lost it. I'll just have to look, and hopefully I'll find it sometime, but maybe to figure out a keyboard that these NCR systems like a little bit better, even though the mul M keyboard works on this system. And here's another thing I wanted to show, and I promise I haven't done anything other than boot the thing. As you can see, I was just curious. I was like wanting to do a running count of, okay, can we check on how many minutes the system's been operational? And the clock is it's tracking for close enough to the what is actually the current time that I set before, way back when, after I went through and then figured out that DS1387 was not necessarily tracking a lot of the time. And the DS1387 is, like I say, the other odd thing is the systems that I'm aware that it's in haven't seemed to lose the configuration or that module failing quite like it has for the DS1287. Maybe it has some sort of circuit that charges or something else. That battery, I thought it would be just a lithium battery in there, just all the same. And I haven't even dremeled into one of them just to figure out the layout, see if the layout is similar. And the only reason that they are in there is what we observed the other day with the undocumented PC utilities, is that microchannel extended CMOS as well. Besides the regular CMOS configuration area, it has 2 kilobyte of that extended CMOS memory, and other PS2s have that in other places on their systems, and on the mul 53 SLC2 from IBM, it has that DS1387, and that's where it has it on that chip. And then, like I say, that's the same planar as that Reply 55 that the Reply Corporation was supplying to put in your mul 55. You kept the riser that you had, and for an upgrade of your system board upgrade. And IBM liked that so much they made a model of it and they called it the 50. There's also the PS2 55LS 486 is that planer as well. And those use that DS1387 as well as this one. I just have to study a little bit more, but that's interesting that all of a sudden, I mean, even on a prior boot, it was not rolling that clock over. I didn't change a thing, and now it has that correct time, and I'm at a loss. But let's get the SkyCam up a little bit more here and go through and measure this temperature and put this fan in place as a last step. Okay, so we're back in the SkyCam, and I mean I can press the enter key just to get it to root to a normal DOS. I mean there might be something that I can go through and we saw the stuff went through all the testing before, and yeah, this system has been probably powered up for about 10 minutes. And I went through and checked it before, and it was just like 98 degrees. And now it is up to, I saw it briefly hit up. I'm just saying center under that heat sink. Along that edge, it's not showing much. On the other, towards the pin 1 is where the and that heat sink should spread the heat out pretty regular, but it looks like it's interesting that opposite pin 1 is just not as, and I don't know if it's thermal sealant that they're doing to get that heat sink on there as well. But right up there by pin 1, it's showing 127 degrees. When tested a little bit ago, it was showing 98 degrees. But as I say, this has been about 10. Yeah, so 129. Maybe get up and run 5 degrees cooler than that OverDrive processor. Or actually, that's the one that didn't work. This is the one that was in there. And so we have a little bit more to check later on. I've got that Trinity Works CPU. You know, I'll get into that at some later point in the video. Maybe when I get to the PS2 Model 77s, we'll look at that a little bit deeper and the switch settings, since that was intended. And I know others that have bought this same CPU from that batch, and the default settings, it worked for them when they plugged it in. I can't remember if I tested the first one I got or not. But, yeah, and so there it's, and that heat is just all over now that other edge is got more heat. Now I saw a little bit above, and close to the 135 degrees. So we're not really gaining much necessarily by that replacement. It's a smaller heat sink, but it does decrease the profile of that, and I would be able to get in. And again, I don't necessarily have to seat it all the way, and I don't have that forward that rises. Don't let metal drift around in the. I mean, I still even had the 8514 adapter here. It's hard to tell with that, without that adapter support in place. But this goes over the top of that. The heat sink. So that is, I mean, in just barely enough room to spare. It's at least plastic, a little bit of metal pins, but I mean, it has clearance. It has clearance from that heat sink, and we can check that once I have this adapter support in place again. But I want to go through, and we will get just going through and pulling this, hopefully this fan, I hadn't pulled it off the heatsink yet to see if the mounts of that 1, 2, all through, and I kind of apologize. I thought this would be a quicker video. I thought we'd be able to cover more, as it was too. And why is my fat screwdriver not working for those screws? There we go. It's working for the other ones. And lastly, like I say, I'll get out a ruler, and I need to provide the dimensions of this fan as well. I don't know if it shows it on the, if it necessarily shows it on the fan itself. CPU cooler made in Taiwan. Brushless. Really, for the model, I don't think it shows enough of innovative. Is what the brand is. And again, you know, for these fans, and of course the heatsink, this fan is blowing down on the heatsink fins, and it shows also the rotational direction for that as well. And I mean, a DC fan, you want it to stutter like that when they're, and you know, you'll come across some and just try and spin them, because if they're frozen, I mean, they're broken. They should, and they kind of do that step with the permanent magnets in there for DC fan. And I have a fan that's bad on the power supply of my IBM Think Center with the Pentium 4 in there. And it's got other fans in operation, but that was the one I was going to show the reference diskette creation on, and I have to replace that fan as well. So that support bracket sits like that. We just have to determine for all that of how we would, I mean, I'm choosing to have the wires at the bottom, and I'm wanting, you know, you're wanting it to, in this is the correct orientation, you're wanting it to pull air in from the front of the system for that convention. Yeah, and this looks like it'd be, this is exactly what was intended. Or is it? Just take some. I might want to shop for to determine if that would, because it just doesn't want to seat all the way down, like the whole, I mean, I could go through and bore that out of there or whatever. That's at least the right dimension. And, you know, I don't think I want to put it in there that loose though, because it's just coming off the, mounts. So maybe I need to either consider opening those holes a little bit more, or just measuring it and getting appropriate fan out there they sell with the Molex leads to do that, and that'll go through and at least blow. There's not a whole bunch of holes or anything else in there, but just the thought of it blowing a little bit of air over this heatsink in here. and anywhere from 115 to 125 degrees. Oh, there was even 140 as of course, that's moving around just different parts. 142 even I saw. I'm not pushing my thumb into it, but yeah, probably a good idea is one comment to get a fan on this. I can just briefly get it back in place. Maybe I should have done that before I had the and I could even maybe seat a fan in there without pulling this assembly out of the way. Okay, I think it's there we go. Still got that power lead tucked back in there. And this front corner of this is a little bit loose too. It looks like it was, there's a clip in there that's not all that tight. So I may need to try and repair that sometime. That latch is still there hanging, but it feels like it's a little loose. And so that looks about the same diameter holes on the one end, but those are too small, of course. But I was looking at maybe that could be captive enough or something else in that position. But I'll get a fan on order anyway to 130. There's even above, just below 140 degrees. But all about the right temperature of that same thing. And I don't know who put in that CPU before, but that looks like it is a wrap. And so let me go through and get back on screen. Okay. Yeah, it looks like it's doing good. And I'll go through and also run this, run through, I need to go through and run it through the paces as well. Make sure it's able to run Windows for all that. And as I say, normally the temperature won't vary in operation. I mean, it could be where the CPU is processing a little bit more and could be running a little bit warmer, but then is it idle? But there's not that much variation with that as it's just sitting there operating. So I'll get a fan on that, but it sounds like this is a good place to end the video. And if you like this wild content like this, and these videos stretching out even longer than what I was for the other video, oh my goodness. So please click on that like button on the video if you like this content, and please subscribe to my channel. Pass the word around. This is IBM Museum. That's all I have for now. Thank you.